Welcome to Performance Task Design, the Scoring Guide, Module 4C.
So now that you're ready for step 5, you've developed your task prompt and you know obviously the things that you're going to be assessing, we're ready to build an actual scoring guide for it. And there are essentially 4 steps to consider when building a scoring guide. The first one is the easiest one. You'll want to list your content and 4C learning targets as separate criteria on your rubric. And we'll go through each of these steps in a moment. Step 2 is to access or build proficiency scales if they're available. If not, you'd want to look back to the standards themselves in order to ensure validity of what you're putting on your scoring guide. Step 3 is going to be using that proficiency scale or using the standards to help you to write descriptions of the 4 performance levels for each criterion that are going to be customized to the specific task you've designed. And then that last step is going to be to assign points as desired to the scoring guide. So let's walk through each of those in a little more detail and tie them back to your task template. I mentioned proficiency scales just a moment ago. If that's a new term for you, they are simply a tool that you can use to really help delineate, what do different mastery levels look like for a particular standard. So in the example that I've used in this module, the standard asks for students to be able to read and create graphs that models the relationship between 2 variables. So that would be at the 3 level, or the meets the target. If students were to partially meet the target, there might be a variety of vocabulary or basic processes that they'd have to engage in to be able to do that essential learning target. Things like being able to read and set up the X and Y axes of a graph, being able to read and plot points on a graph, draw lines of best fit, describe the connections between independent and dependent variables. And if students haven't learned how to kind of do all of those things simultaneously, they may only be partially meeting the target. A 1 simply says they haven't met it yet because they've got minimal success of those supporting targets. And a 4 would show what would it mean to actually go beyond the grade level expectation to exceed that target. And in this case, it would mean I can use a graph to make predictions. So if these are tools that you already have available to you in your district, they're going to be extremely useful in designing a scoring guide. If they aren't tools that you have, you certainly could create them yourselves using the same basic process. Or minimally, you'll want to go back to the standards to at least determine what is proficiency set by the standard, and you can kind of figure this out as you build your scoring guide. So let's again go through each of these 4 steps. The first step is simply to kind of build the skeleton of your scoring guide. And so what you would want to do is go through and list each content learning target and each 4C learning target as a separate criterion on your rubric. And if you're using our template, where we have a rubric in that task template for you, what you'll want to go through, we've kind of pre-populated it with a number of different content knowledge blanks in each of the 4Cs. So if you aren't using 3 or 4 learning targets from your content area and you're only using 1, you delete the rows you don't need. And if you're only using 1 of the 4Cs, you delete the rows you don't need. So ultimately you have a template or a skeleton of a scoring guide that's customized for you. Next, you would want to get out proficiency scales, if you have them, right, for any and all of the learning targets that you have on your scoring guide. Again, if you don't have proficiency scales, there are some that are available online. Marzano's got a bank for free that you could use. Or like I said, you may want to design your own, or you may just want to look back at the standard. But the point is that you're using something to help you write the individual performance descriptors so that what you're setting as proficiency is valid and it's grounded in the same criteria that your district or the state is going to use to determine what's a grade level expectation. At that point, you're ready to, again, use that proficiency scale, whatever tool you're using to ground you in validity, to actually start to spell out each of the 4 performance levels for each criterion. And you'd use it 1 step at a time, usually beginning with the meets target, because that's what we're shooting for. And so, again, here's just an example from my example that I've been sharing in this module. So I would have started with what's in red here on modeling with graphs. For me to figure out what would go in the meets target, I looked at my proficiency scale and saw again that proficiency is defined for this particular learning target as I can read and create a graph that models the relationship between 2 variables. So I took that proficiency scale language and I adapted it to my task, which was about stock market graphs. And so what I wrote in my scoring guide in red is the group's graph accurately models the change in 5 stock prices over a year. So it's consistent with the language of the proficiency scale. It's meeting the target there, but it's also describing how students would meet that target in the context of the scenario I've given them with the stock markets. At that point, I typically would move left. So I would go over next and say, well, what would it mean to partially meet that target? And so on my scoring guide, I wrote that the group's graph makes some mistakes in modeling the change in 5 stock prices over a year, which is consistent with some of those supporting targets on that proficiency scale. I then go over to the does not meet target, and that would say something like the group's graph is largely incomplete and prevents viewers from discerning key information. So again, I'm distinguishing different performance levels based on the graph that they're building for my task. And then finally, I go back to the exceeds target. I look back at what would it mean to go beyond the grade level standard. And in this case, it means not only are they accurately modeling, but somehow they're making a prediction. So in my case, it might say that the group's graph accurately models the change in 5 stock prices over a year and predicts future changes. They're going above and beyond that grade level standard. And so again, I would do this same type of activity for each of the criteria in my scoring guide. I would move on to critical thinking next and do exactly the same process until I had built the entire scoring guide out. And then the last piece to consider is how then might I want to grade this? Right now, it's written in a way that would allow you to evaluate student performance, but without associating any sort of points or letter grades to it. And so to the extent that you want to have points or letter grades, there are some questions you need to ask yourself. One might be, what weight do you want to place on each criterion? So in other words, in my example, I decided that since it was a math class, I really wanted to give more weight to the modeling with graphs target than I did each of the 4 C's. And so I put a multiplier in there so that that particular score was worth double what some of the others would, so that it was worth a bigger portion of the overall grade. Another question you might ask yourself is, what numerical values do you want to use for scoring to align certain performance levels with traditional grade percentages? So what you'll notice when you look at my example is I did not just go 1, 2, 3, 4. I could have, but if I had done that, partially meets would mean that students would be getting a 50% for this task, and does not meet would mean students would be getting a 25%. And for me, that didn't necessarily jive with what my grading philosophy is. And so to the extent that you need to use a common grading philosophy that's set by your district or by your PLC, you would want to use that. To the extent that you're doing it for yourself, you'd want to kind of pick scores that jive with your personal philosophy. Ultimately, in my example, I decided that I thought exceeding the standard would be 100%, meeting the standard would be an 80%, partially meeting would be a 60%, and does not meet would be a 40%. And so I wrote my scores to align with those grading levels. And then a third kind of question to ask yourself as you're looking at the task overall is, will you be able to score student work with precision and efficiency? And if the answer to either of those questions is not a hearty yes, you might want to go back and continue to tweak and refine your scoring guide until you feel confident that it's going to be a tool that serves you well.